Good morning, my friends. Good morning, good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. If you're out in the lobby, go ahead and come on in. Make your way to your seats. If you are sitting by yourself, you're going to want to move to where you're close to at least, 2 or 3 other people. We will spend some time in small groups today. So you're going to want to be able to break out into small groups at a couple different occasions today. If you're sitting by yourself, you don't want to be by yourself. I'm looking at people who are by themselves and hoping that they have friends coming to them. That's my hope. As you came in today, you should have received 2 things. You should have received one of these handouts. They were on the music stands by the doors. If you do not have a handout, you're going to want one. So go ahead and either raise your hand up nice and high and hope someone finds you, or make your way out to the lobby. And Dustin's grabbing them. Thank you, Dustin. Keep your hand up real high if you don't have a handout, and Dustin is going to get you a handout. And then you're also going to need one of these Joy to the World Advent books. So if you don't have one of these, raise your other hand up real high, and somehow we will manage to get you an Advent book. So if you don't have an Advent book, look at Cody and point at him. If you don't have a handout, look at Dustin and get Dustin's attention. And that's how we'll play that. All right. Everybody should be getting a handout and a book. If you are missing either one, raise your hand up nice and high, and we'll get it to you. Handout and a book. All right. With your book, by the way, these are not tucked inside of the book. These are out there on the stands as well, but you may have received it last week. These are bookmarks. These bookmarks show on the front what the topic is for each of our 4 lessons in this series, anticipating Advent in the Old Testament. And you can see that today we're talking about the greater prophet. And on the back is several check boxes, 25 check boxes, for you to check off each day as you read the book. So this is to serve you, to help you, so that you can keep track of where you've been, what you've done, and you can stay up with us. If you did not get a bookmark and you don't have one of those yet, you don't need it now, but you can get one before you leave church today. They are out there in the lobby. Well, I am so excited that it is finally Christmas season. Anybody else feel like 2024 just flew by? Like you just got used to saying 2023 and now 2024 is almost over? It's December already, Sean. What did you do, brother? It did, didn't it? Man. But I'm excited. It's Christmas season. And this year, the elders, the pastors, we decided to do a joint first hour service, first hour class where we're going to be teaching through what it was like for Old Testament saints to anticipate the coming of their Messiah. And we think about that anticipation in a number of different ways, and we're going to talk about that in this class. But part of that means talking about Advent. Now, if you're familiar with the word Advent, Advent just means coming. It's a fancy way of saying the coming of Christ, the advent of Christ. So when we celebrate Advent, we're celebrating the coming of Christ. And for centuries, Christians have celebrated Advent by marking, beginning 4 Sundays before Christmas, marking the time between 4 Sundays before Christmas all the way up until Christmas, considering Christ and anticipating his coming and celebrating all that he did, because really it's too much joy to try to squeeze into just one day. So this year we want to help you do that. We want to do that together through these Advent devotionals that we have purchased, and it is our hope, our goal, that all of the people in our church will read this devotion, one tiny little devotion each day, 25 days, that gets us to Christmas, and we can, all in one accord, celebrate the coming of Christ and grow in our adoration for our Messiah. And I'm excited to be able to do that with our church body and to be able to do it together in this class. So part of this class will include breaking up into small groups and discussing what you read the previous week and what you gleaned from that and how it helped you adore Jesus more, how it helped you appreciate Advent more. And so at the beginning of each class, you can expect sometime in the first 10 minutes, we're going to break out into small groups and you're going to talk about what you read in this book. And we're going to do something like that today, and I'll give you some instructions on that. But first, I want to give you some ideas on how to use this book. It certainly would be possible for you to just stick this in your purse or in your pocket or carry it with you, and just as you think of it, you grab it off the shelf or wherever you placed it and read the next chapter. You could do that, though that is probably not the most successful way to accomplish this. If that's your plan, to just kind of wing it, then you're planning to fail. You might succeed, but you're planning to fail. It's much better to have a plan going into it. And so several suggestions come to my mind. First of all, it's always going to be better to read in community, to read with other people around you. If you have a family, if you're married and you have some kids, then that's going to be the ideal situation. You're going to be able to read it with your spouse or with your children, and you can read it together, discuss it together. That's going to be fantastic. If you are on your own, then I recommend finding a friend, finding a buddy, and reading it with them. Even if you just call them at the same time each day and say, hey, let's read our Advent together. That's going to help you be more successful in sticking with it and reading each of these days. Now, it's going to take you all of 3, maybe 5 minutes to read one of these devotions. But if you're doing it in community, it's going to be better. You're going to be able to digest it together and talk about it and appreciate it together. So that's the first tip, is do it in community, preferably with your family. If you can do family devotions, that's going to be great. Second tip, try to do it at a set time each day. Either, okay, we're going to do it before we start our day. We're going to do it before school or before work. Each morning we're going to get up and we're going to do this first thing. That's a great way to do it. Or you can do it between dinner and dessert. That might be the favorite way to do it. You just bring them out at the dinner table, and before anybody gets any leftover Thanksgiving pie, you just read the next day, and then you get your dessert while you're talking about it. Or another good way to do it is right before it's time to get ready for bed. Right before it's time to get ready for bed at night, before the kids have brushed their teeth, and it's before that's important, you tell them, all right, everybody gets to pick out one piece of leftover Halloween candy, and you read your devotion while they eat their leftover Halloween candy. How many families have like buckets of leftover Halloween candy? Yeah, if you don't have any, come find me. I have buckets of leftover Halloween candy, and I'm absolutely sure my kids won't notice if I give you several handfuls. So there are several different ways to do it, but read in community. That's going to help you succeed. And have a set time. That's going to help you succeed. Now, here's what I want you to do. Right now, we're going to break out into groups. And in your groups, you're going to read the introduction in this book. So hopefully someone in your group can read the small font in here. If your group is maybe predominantly white-haired, then grab a youngster and have them read it to you. But the introduction in this book is right before day one, after the preface, and it's intended to be read before you start day one. So you're going to read the introduction here in class, and then later on, sometime today, you're going to read day one, because today's December 1st, and you'll read day one later. But you're going to read the introduction. I want you to read the introduction. I want you to discuss with your group your plans to read these daily devotions, including what time you're going to read it and who you're going to read it with. And you don't have to set these plans in stone. You're not chiseling it out right now. But you're going to discuss your plans and brainstorm your ideas. So take 10 minutes right now, read this introduction, and discuss what time you're going to read it and who you're going to read it with. Go. All right, friends. I think everybody's about had a chance to read the introduction and lay down some ideas, some potential, some provisional plans to read the book and who they're going to read it with. There were a few latecomers. If you did not receive a book or a handout, raise your hand up nice and high and get Dustin's attention, and he'd be happy to give you one. One other note, by the way, on the book, before we move on, you'll notice if you turn to that page that everybody skips, that talks about like the copyright information of the page of the book. The book was previously published by Desiring God under the title Good News of Great Joy. Now that's significant for you because Desiring God publishes almost everything for free online. So you can get a free PDF of this, a free digital version of this, under the title Good News of Great Joy from Desiring God's website. That's relevant for you if you want to share it, if you want to read it digitally and you don't want to deal with a paper format, or if you want large print. You can open it up digitally and you can tell your computer to zoom that bad boy in to 500%, Miss Carol, and it will show you one letter per scroll, and you can read it that way, nice and big. So there are no excuses. You have a paper copy, you can get it digitally, Desiring God's website. Good News of Great Joy is what you're going to look for, and we'll go from there. Well, I mentioned to you that this series that we are teaching through is called Anticipating Advent in the Old Testament. And when we think of anticipating the first coming of Christ, most of the time the first thing that comes to our mind, the first thing we think of are several direct prophecies of Jesus, where he will come, Bethlehem, and who he will be born to, of the seed of Jesse through the line of David. And we can think of some of these specific prophecies and know, okay, well, that's what we're looking for. We might also think about some specific promises, like we've been in the book of Genesis for the last little while in our Sunday morning worship services, and we saw in Genesis 3:15 the promise of a seed that would crush the head of the serpent and that would deliver humanity from this curse of sin. Well, that promise is echoed all through the Old Testament. We also have the promise of a new covenant given in the Old Testament, that there would be this new law, this new promise, this new arrangement of how God would operate with mankind that would not be based on the law. And so we have different promises in the Old Testament. Those are all great. That's not what we're talking about in this class, though. This class, we're going to be talking about another way that the Old Testament anticipates the coming of Christ. We're going to be talking about these anticipations that the Old Testament weaves through the narratives and through the writings as what you might call patterns or shadows. Or the fancy theological word for it is types. The word type is just another way of saying a pattern or a shadow. And types, the study of types, refers to the field of typology. If you've ever heard the word typology, that's referring to the study of types in the Old Testament. The places where the Old Testament anticipates what's going to happen in the New Testament by giving some kind of a picture or a figure or something that is designed to look like what's going to happen. Now, when we put it that way, when I just throw it out there, it sounds confusing. It sounds strange. It sounds hard to follow. But this is something that we deal with every day. We deal with types all the time. So here's a couple examples for you. First of all, who all likes to watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade on Thanksgiving morning? Handful of people. My family used to watch it a lot more, and it's just gotten progressively worse. I'll just say that. And so we watch much less of it than we used to. But always, after the Thanksgiving Day parade is my daughter's favorite thing. My daughter's favorite Thanksgiving tradition is the National Dog Show. Right, Hattie, the National Dog Show? Anybody else watch the National Dog Show or the Great American Dog Show or whatever they call it? Handful of people. Lots of people love the dog show. Who won Best in Show this year, Hattie? The Pug. The Pug won Best in Show. Now, I have a question for you. How do they determine that pug is the best? Well, here's my understanding. I'm not a dog breeder. My understanding is that there are a set of characteristics against which these dogs are measured. You see, each breed of dog or each type of dog has specific measurements, the length, its height, that it's supposed to meet. And it has to be in perfect health, and it has to exhibit perfect behavior. And the dog that is the best in show is the dog that best fulfills its type. It's the best example of what that type of dog is supposed to be. It has all the right measurements, it behaves in all the right ways, it does all the right things, and it gets best in show because it's the best fulfillment of the type. So when we see types, we're used to that. We see a kind of thing, and we figure, okay, what's the best of that kind of thing? And that's what the National Dog Show does. Or consider another example. Right now, this building is filled with fake Christmas trees. We love Ruthie Williamson, and Ruthie Williamson loves to decorate, and she loves Christmas trees. Let me tell you, we've got a big fake Christmas tree up there. I got to help put it up. That was fun. 20 feet up in the air or whatever. But it's there, and you're going to like it. All right? Now, I have never been to a tree farm. I have never been to one of these places where you actually cut down a real Christmas tree. Anybody like real Christmas trees, and you go to the Christmas tree farm and you cut down a real Christmas tree, a handful of you? I've never been. I've never been to one. But you know what? I've seen enough fake Christmas trees that I think I could probably figure out what a real one looks like. I think I could probably figure out what a real Christmas tree looks like. If I were to make my way to a Christmas tree farm, I could probably find my way around. And I've seen enough trees to know what a healthy tree looks like versus a dead tree. If I go to a Christmas tree farm and I see 100 Christmas trees, I can probably go, well, I don't want the one that's all brown. I don't want the one that's all leaning over and crooked. I don't want the one with all the broken branches. Even though I've never been to a Christmas tree farm, I've seen enough of the pattern, enough of the types, that I could probably make my way to a Christmas tree farm and find a semi-decent tree. Now, those of you that have been to one before, maybe Isaac Lancaster could give me some tips, and he could tell me, no, you really don't want that one. You want this one over here. Maybe. But I could probably pick out a halfway decent tree. In the same way, the Old Testament gives us patterns of a thing to come or a person to come. And it shows us all of these different aspects and facets of this type and tells us, anticipate something like this, but it's going to be better. Another illustration for you, because I know this is complicated. I know this can be weird. So here's another way to think of it. Imagine you're 16 years old and you just got your driver's license. Does that describe anybody in here? 16 years old, just got your driver's license? Yeah, Steve. Okay. I believe you, brother. Now, when you're 16 years old and you just get your driver's license, what you think is going to happen is that all of a sudden you have all this freedom, right? What really happens? You become the family errand boy. You're the one who gets to go to the grocery store when mama needs something that she forgot or when something goes bad. So I want you to imagine for a second that you're 16 years old, you just got your driver's license, and your mom is going to make something in the kitchen, and she's going to use plantains. She's going to use a plantain. Anybody ever eaten a plantain? Yeah, lots of people. Great. So plantains, they look like bananas, right? They don't taste like bananas, but they look like bananas. Now, 16-year-old kid, good chance they have no idea what a plantain is. So mom tells 16-year-old kid, listen, I need you to go to the grocery store and I need you to buy a plantain. The one I have here on the counter, it's rotten. It's no good. And she could pick it up and she could show him, like, this is what a bad plantain looks like. I don't want you to get a bad plantain. I want you to get a good plantain. And then she could walk him over to another part of the counter and say, these are bananas. It'll look like a banana. Don't bring me back a banana. Bring me back a plantain. But if you get a fruit that looks like a banana, you're close. And then she sends him off to the grocery store with some cash in hand. Well, if he comes back from the grocery store with a nice, perfect, ripe plantain, then he's done well. The types did their job. They directed him to the right thing. If he comes back from the grocery store with a banana, well, then his mom might pat him on the back and say, it's okay, you're an idiot, but go back to the grocery store and try again. If he comes back from the grocery store with a pineapple, she's probably not going to send him back to the grocery store. If he comes back from the grocery store with a new pair of shoes, he's probably going to lose his license. The point is that there was an expectation that the types would establish a pattern that was reliable enough that the 16-year-old could take that pattern and the information in it and reliably go to the store and identify what he needed and bring it back. This is what you were looking for. And so in the Old Testament, there are a few different patterns or types or expectations that the authors lay out for the Messiah, for what he would look like, for who he would be like. And in our class, we're going to talk about 4 specific patterns and 4 ways that those patterns are revealed in the Old Testament. So looking at your handout, 4 patterns that the Old Testament expected the Messiah to fulfill. We see that the Old Testament expects the Messiah to fulfill the pattern of the prophet. And this pattern is based off of the prophet Moses. And so the Old Testament authors hold up Moses and say, this is a defective prophet. He did a lot of things right, but he was still a sinner. Here's the defects. Look for a perfect one. And then the Old Testament gives us the pattern of the king and holds up David and says, here's David. He was a defective king. Here's the things he did right. Here's the things he did wrong. Now look forward to a perfect king. And then we have the pattern of the priest. And this pattern goes all the way back to Melchizedek. And it's established the Levitical priesthood fulfills some of this. We see it in a few different ways. But the Old Testament tells us to expect a priest in the line of Melchizedek. Look for that guy. And then the Old Testament expects us, or tells us to expect a servant, and offers up the nation of Israel as a failed servant, and describes what the perfect suffering servant is going to be like. And so in this class, our objective is to kind of unpack these 4 patterns that the Old Testament expected as a way for Old Testament saints to anticipate the coming of the Messiah, to be able to recognize him. Oh yeah, I've seen something like that before. I saw the rotten plantain. I know what a good plantain ought to look like. I've seen artificial Christmas trees. I know what a real Christmas tree ought to look like. I saw the defective prophet, the defective priest, the defective king. I know what the real one's going to look like. And then we're going to go to the New Testament and we're going to show how Jesus perfectly fulfills these patterns. That's our goal. Now, if you want more examples of what we just talked about in these patterns, sometimes the word shadow is used. There's shadows in the Old Testament, and the appendix in the back of your book, page 59 and 60, actually has a list of a handful others that we're not necessarily going to talk very much about in this class, but you can see it's all over the place. This is a common thing in the Old Testament where the authors would would put something in place as a pattern or a shadow or a type so that when the Messiah comes, they'd recognize him. Yeah, I've seen something like that before, but this is better. Old Testament shadows. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about this first pattern, the pattern of the prophet, and how Jesus is the greater prophet. Look with me, if you would, at Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 19. It's about the bottom of that front page of your handout. Now, sometimes the Old Testament put down patterns, types, shadows, and it wasn't immediately obvious that that was a pattern. But sometimes, very helpfully, the author just straight up tells us, look for something like this. And that's what we get in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 18, starting in verse 15. This is Moses talking to the people of Israel, and he tells them, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear, according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, what they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." So Moses tells the people of Israel and establishes a pattern for the rest of the Old Testament to follow. Expect a prophet that looks like Moses, but is better. Expect a prophet that looks like Moses and is better. And so all throughout the Old Testament, we get these stories of the prophets. And we get to hear what they did and how they lived. And we get to see their various shortcomings, their various failures. It's a little bit like walking through the sanctuary in the lobby of this church and seeing all the fake Christmas trees. And we know what a real Christmas tree is going to look like because we've seen the fake ones. Well, here's all these defective prophets. They weren't quite perfect. They had a defect. They were sinners. And God promises there's going to be a prophet down the road that looks like Moses, that's patterned after Moses, but he's better. All right, so I want you to take 5 minutes in your groups, turn your sheet over. I want you to list 10 things that you remember Moses did. And we're going to build out this pattern. What is the prophet like Moses supposed to look like? Well, we got to look at Moses. So, in your groups, write out 10 things you remember Moses did. May not have finished all 10, but we'll help you out. We'll complete it together. Paul, give me one thing that your group came up with. What's something Moses did? Not Jesus, Moses. What's something Moses did? He led the Hebrews out of Egypt. Good. Cody, what's something that Paul didn't mention?
He mediated God's blessings and curses to his people and his enemies.
Mediated God's blessings and curses to his people and his enemies. Taylor, what's something else Moses did? He wore a veil. That's right. Mike, what's something else Moses did? He hit the rock instead of talking to it. Donnell, what's something else Moses did? He parted the Red Sea. Somebody else. Leah, what's something else Moses did? He took a trip in a basket down the river. Yeah, Ian. He killed an Egyptian. What's something else? Steve. Yes, born into royalty, sets it aside. Good. Sarah, what's something else Moses did? He did not enter the promised land. He died before entering the promised land. Tim. He brought the law to God's people. Very good. Dustin. What's that? He stood up to Pharaoh. Sean. He saw God. Very powerful. All right. All great examples of things that Moses did. Now, I want you to turn your attention to Deuteronomy 34, 9 through 12. It's the passage there in the middle on the back of your handout. Deuteronomy 34, 9 through 12. By this point, Moses has died on the mountain. The authority has been handed over to Joshua to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. This is what the author of Deuteronomy says. Now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. All right, a couple things to notice about this passage. First of all, the very last 4 verses of Deuteronomy were probably not written by Moses. He was dead. We're not actually sure who wrote these last few verses when it says, but since then there has not arisen. If I were to harbor a guess, I would say maybe Ezra. But we don't really know. What we know is that when the Old Testament canon was closed, the Old Testament prophets had stopped revealing, that they could look at this and say, there has still not been a prophet like Moses. And then look at the descriptors, the patterns and the specific things that they're looking for. Well, what will this prophet like Moses do? Well, Moses knew the Lord face to face. That's a big deal. There was no other prophet who knew the Lord face to face. Moses did all those signs and wonders in the land of Egypt before Pharaoh. There's been some similarities with other prophets, but nothing quite like that. And Moses demonstrated mighty power with all great terror in the sight of all Israel. Well, some of the prophets did some pretty cool things. I think of Elijah on Mount Carmel, surrounded by the prophets of Baal, calls down fire from heaven, burns up the altar. That's pretty cool. But we don't get much more than that. So by the end of the prophetic time, the return from exile and Israel's back in the land, they are still waiting for a prophet that's going to fill out this pattern. They've seen a whole lot of fake Christmas trees, and they're still waiting for the real one that's standing tall. And then we get to the New Testament, and we get the coming of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, having left royalty and humbly taken the position of a servant, is born in the lowliest of circumstances, has a special birth narrative described of him. He wasn't floated down a river, but we get his birth narrative. We get to hear about how he was raised and grew up and learned. And then we hear about some of the wonders that he did, some of the incredible authority that he had. And we get to see that Jesus really is this prophet, better than Moses, the one that all the Old Testament saints and prophets pointed to. So I want to show you this in a couple ways. Notice when we look, if you turn back to the front page, the front of your handout, in the Deuteronomy 18 passage, when the promise is first given of a prophet like Moses, the Lord, through Moses, helps the people of Israel remember that day when God met with them at Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai. This recalls Deuteronomy chapter 5 and Exodus chapter 19. It recalls the story of when the whole nation of Israel came to the foot of Mount Sinai, and God himself spoke from the mountain such that all of the people of Israel heard the voice of God. Now, sometimes when we imagine this scene, we just imagine like thunder and lightning and smoke. Or we just imagine like Moses went up the mountain and he received the 10 Commandments and he brought them down. But that's actually not what Scripture says. What Scripture says in Exodus 19 and Deuteronomy 5 is that all of Israel met around Mount Sinai, met with God, and God himself thundered his voice in an audible, understandable way in the ears of every single person in the nation of Israel, such that every single person in the nation of Israel heard the 10 Commandments from God for themselves. They heard it, and they were terrified. They were absolutely floored and scared out of their minds. And they pleaded with Moses. They begged Moses, listen, Moses, if we continue to hear directly from the voice of God, his voice will kill us. We cannot survive listening directly to the voice of God any longer. We need someone to go up for us. We can't survive. Nobody can live through this, so you go. And they send Moses up as a sacrificial lamb. Like, hopefully Moses could survive, but we know we can't. And they send Moses up the mountain. And Moses meets with God there on the mountain. And God tells Moses the people were right to be afraid. They can't sustain to hear this. In Deuteronomy 5, verse 27, this is what the people of Israel say to Moses. They say, "You go near and hear all that the Lord your God may say, and tell us all that the Lord our God says to you, and we will hear and do it." Verse 28, "Then the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." You see, the people of Israel had a problem. Their hard hearts prevented them from being able to hear, fear, understand, and obey the voice of the Lord. And so God uses Moses as an intermediary to reveal his will to the people. Moses knew God. He met with him face to face on the mountain, and he met with him in the tabernacle. And you mentioned he had to wear a veil because his face was shining when he would come out from meeting God face to face. Moses knew God. But look how much more intimately Jesus knew God. Jesus was God. Jesus knew the Father from eternity past. And if we look at Matthew chapter 11, verse 27, we see that Jesus describes that he knew the Father in a way that no one else did or could. And yet he makes him known to us. Matthew 11:27, all things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him. Jesus offers the perfect revelation of the Father. The author of Hebrews says it this way. He says that God spoke through the prophets in times past, but then he spoke through his Son Jesus as the perfect representation, the perfect image of God. Moses could only write and declare what he heard from God, but Jesus speaks the very voice of God and reveals God personally. How incredible is that revelation that we have? That's the first two bullets there. The next bullet, that third bullet, we see that Moses put Egypt's gods to shame. When we look at the plagues of Egypt, we can track each of those plagues and see which Egyptian god the God of Israel was mocking. When God made the sun dark, he's mocking Egypt's sun god Ra. Oh, you think you have power over the sun? I'm going to make it dark, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. When Moses enacts these different plagues, he is putting the gods of Egypt to shame. But what do we find out in the New Testament? In the New Testament, the demons fear Jesus. And Jesus puts all the principalities and the powers to shame. In Colossians chapter 2, Paul tells us that Jesus puts them to open shame. All of them. Not a subset of the false gods, but all of them. Jesus did so much more, so much better. All of the stories in the Gospels of the exorcisms are stories of Jesus effortlessly putting false gods and demons to shame in a way that Moses couldn't. We see, of course, famously, Moses was the intermediary through whom God gave manna in the wilderness or in the desert. God fed the people. Well, you know, some of the most famous miracles that Jesus did, feeding the 4,000, feeding the 5,000. And when the gospel author John tells us about Jesus feeding the 5,000 in John chapter 5, the people who witnessed this miracle thought immediately, this must be the prophet. Look, John chapter 6, starting in verse 11, John says, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. They see the miracle, and they're immediately thinking, this has got to be the prophet like Moses. Now, in their hard-heartedness, they fail to recognize what Jesus is actually doing. And John goes on to describe Jesus' interaction with this idea, because they were really looking for a prophet like Moses who would feed them, who would fill their bellies. And Jesus came to do so much more and so much better than what Moses could do. And so when we skip ahead in the book of John, chapter 6, I'm going to start in verse 30. These people approach Jesus and they say, "What sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" In other words, they're still skeptical. Maybe this is the prophet, maybe not. Let's see it again. Let's get another proof here. Verse 31, "Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." Then they said to him, "Lord, give us this bread always." And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." You see, Moses was able to feed a crowd in a wilderness. Jesus did that too. But Jesus did something better. He gave himself as the bread of life. He is greater by far than Moses. He's following the pattern, and we see it in all its beauty. Of course, we know that Moses redeemed Israel from slavery in Egypt. And the New Testament shows us that the redemption that we have through Jesus Christ is so much better. It's not redemption from physical slavery, from enslavement to oppressors in this life. It's redemption from enslavement to sin and death. What a remarkable thought. When God told Moses to expect another better prophet, He told them that because the Israelites had hard hearts, that they would fail to understand what God wanted. They needed another prophet who would be able to break through this hard-heartedness and show them and give them real redemption and save them from their hard-heartedness. And that is Jesus Christ, the one to whom Moses points, the one who delivers us from our hard-heartedness, from our sin, and from the death that is the penalty of sin, that separation from God. We see also Moses mediated for Israel even though he was a sinner. And this summarizes several different stories of Moses throughout the narratives, but I'm thinking in particular of that time when the nation of Israel is approaching the promised land for the first time from the south. And they send the spies in, right? And all 12 spies report how amazing the promised land is, how incredible this land is. But 10 of the 12 spies tell them, but we can't actually have this land because it's inhabited by giants. The cities of this land are fortresses with walls too tall for us to conquer. There is no hope. We should go back to Egypt. And the people of Israel listen to the 10 spies who deceive them rather than the 2 spies who are telling the truth about what God can do. And Moses intercedes on behalf of Israel and asks God, "Do not destroy this people. Keep your promise to them." And so Moses leads that people through the wilderness for 40 years before they get a second try at going into the promised land. But in that 40 years, Moses sins. He strikes the rock instead of commanding it to give water. Jesus is our perfect mediator. When we sin, when we fail to believe God's promises, when we fail to respond to God the way He expects us to respond to Him, we need a mediator. Israel had Moses. We have Jesus Christ, who intercedes forever for us, seated at the right hand of God. Paul tells us that we have one mediator between God and man, the Lord Jesus Christ. What an incredible hope and promise we have. Jesus is greater than Moses because Jesus is the perfect mediator, completely without sin. And lastly, the last point I want to bring out to you, there's so much more that we could offer here. The way that the New Testament authors portray Jesus as having fulfilled this prophetic expectation, this pattern, this type. We see it in Hebrews chapter 3. You can write these down if you want. Hebrews 3, 1 through 6. Acts chapter 3, 18 through 24. Peter teaches this in his sermon. Acts chapter 7, 20 through 53. Stephen teaches this as his sermon. But one last point I want to bring out to you. In Mark chapter 9, we get the story of Jesus' transfiguration. And I want you to hear this in light of what we've just talked about with Jesus as the prophet like Moses. Mark 9, verse 2. Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Now I want you to remember for a second Moses going up on a high mountain to receive the will of God. And here Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain. Verse 3. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. He's shining. Remember Moses' face shining with the veil in front of it. Well, here Jesus is shining. Verse 4. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Two examples of the pattern right here next to the perfect fulfillment of the pattern. Here's Moses. Expect a prophet like Moses. Here's Elijah, the closest we come in the Old Testament to a prophet like Moses. And here's Jesus shining, talking to them. Verse 5. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Suddenly, when they had looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. God speaking from the mountain so that the hearers would understand and know his will. And his will is not just mediated through 10 commandments or through Moses, but his will is mediated through a man, Jesus Christ, who perfectly fulfills the prophet like Moses. And remember, when God gave the promise of a prophet like Moses, he said, Him you shall hear. He commanded the people to hear that prophet. And here in Mark 9, verse 7, God from the mountain commands the disciples, hear him. He is the one you were expecting. He is the one to whom everyone will be accountable. And now it stands this day that every single person on the earth is accountable to hear the words of Jesus and respond to them. Deuteronomy 18, verse 19, and it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him. The exclusivity of the gospel, that we can only come to the Father through the Son, and that we have to hear the words of Jesus and respond to the voice of Jesus as he reveals the Father. The only way to salvation is rooted in this pattern of the prophet like Moses. Let me pray, and then we got to open the back doors and let other people come in. I have a small gift for you, by the way. I have these little coins. These are gospel coins. On the front of them, for those of you who have eyes to see, you will be able to read the 10 Commandments. And on the back of them, you can read the gospel and see how Jesus gives us life in spite of our failure to live up to the 10 Commandments. And you can take one of these coins as a reminder that Jesus perfectly fulfills the law and is the greater prophet, the prophet like Moses. These are up here on the front pew. Be sure to grab one. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I do thank you and praise you that you have revealed yourself so perfectly, so thoroughly through Jesus Christ, through his mediating work, through his redeeming work, through his magnificent saving work that we get to witness and we get to read about. And I ask that you would help each and every one of us grow in our adoration of Christ. Help us to see him for who he is. Help us to hear him and respond to him. It's in his name we pray. Amen.